everybody, welcome back. And if you're wondering why my voice sounds weird, it's because today I'm looking at a vocoder app called VoiceBot by Erik Sigth.
And I just bypassed it there. So this is not a new app, but it's had a major update, including being made audio unit, which of course is great. We all love everything to be audio units. We can open multiple instances and all the other good benefits that we get from audio units. Now, before I begin, let me just play a little bit. Got a very topical sounding preset here. We can load presets here, okay, using this little file button. Let's just get this preset called Change To.
Change is in the air. 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 Change is in the air.
All right, so far so Daft Punk, right? Sounding very good, this. Now, this is definitely an app that can be a bit bewildering when you first look at it. Like all of Erik's apps, he makes extremely interesting apps. He's quite a beloved developer, I would say, in the community, especially among people who like things that are a little bit different. And the interfaces are very cool, but somewhat cryptic. Although, one very important thing, which you really wouldn't notice, I think, is, first of all, this icon button in the top left corner. Very important for two reasons. One reason, it opens up to the second page where we get some modulation possibilities. And another very important reason is on the right here, we have the help button. So if we click this help button, we can then click in various places and find out what these different icons and things mean. Okay, so let's have a little look. Now,
Change is in the air.
let me change this preset. Actually, speaking of change, let's try this. Okay. Now, one thing you might see here is I'm pressing and nothing is happening. This is something that could bewilder a first-time user, because if we look down here, we can see there is no kind of file loaded in here. And that means that we need to use some kind of external input. So how do we do that? We turn input on and off by clicking on this microphone button. So now my input is on.
When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out.
Now we've got stuff going on. So what I have done here is I've set up an instance of Playbeat and loaded a sample in here. And so that's what we're listening to. And this sample comes from a pack that I remember someone mentioned this. I can't remember where I got it, but it was mentioned in the Audiobus forum. A free sample pack, got some pretty cool stuff from old movies and things. It's called Zevon MC Indoor. Maybe just take a look around and find that, if it's still available online. Should be, I think. So currently that's what I'm using for input. Now, you can see here that when I'm pressing on the keys, we have this little black horizontal line. This refers to the modulation on the second page. So you see here, when I press lower on the key, I've got a low bit rate. You hear a higher bit rate. We turn these on and off by pressing on them. We have different things here. For example, okay, let's see. The number of bands.
You're out when someone calls. You're out when someone calls.
Let me turn that bands off. Okay. Here, frequency.
You're out when someone calls, and you're out when someone calls, and you're out when someone calls, and you're out when someone calls.
Turn it off. The amount of delay.
Someone calls, and you're out when someone calls, and you're out when someone calls.
Probably need to adjust the delay over on the other screen to make that more noticeable. The flanger.
You're out when someone calls, and you're out when someone calls, and you're out when someone calls, and you're
Vibrato.
when someone calls, and you're out when someone calls, and you're out when someone calls.
So basically when I press low on a key,
and you're out when someone calls.
the effect is not triggered. When I press higher, the effect is triggered more.
And you're out when someone calls.
And we can adjust the start point of the effect and the stop point as well. Here, pitch.
When someone calls and you're out. When someone calls and you're out. When someone calls and you're out.
And we can turn this whole modulation on and off here. So here it's just normal. Here when I press on a note, you can see we don't have the horizontal line and none of this modulation is being triggered. Here, dynamic, this is where we can trigger this modulation. And you can also set up MPE keyboards to work in this way. So you could play this with your instrument or Rolly C-board or whatever. Okay, here's
and you're out when someone calls.
setting
And
for
you're out when
noise,
someone calls.
BPM, sync to the DAW on and off, okay, MIDI and so on. And we already talked about the help button over there. Let's go back to the main screen.
And you're out when someone calls. And you're out when someone
So here we have gain.
calls. And you're out when someone calls. And you're out when someone calls.
If that's down completely, then we'll have silence.
And you're out when someone calls. And you're out.
Here we have the threshold level. Now here we can see the level of the input signal. What happens if we put the threshold higher than that? Well, you can see what happens. We have no sound. What happens if we put the threshold level right down at the bottom?
You're out when someone calls. And you're out when someone calls.
Then, no matter what the amplitude of any given part of the signal, we will hear the vocoder effect. What happens if we put it up somewhere, let's say here, so we can see that currently the signal is dipping below the threshold level sometimes.
Someone calls. You're out. Someone calls.
So you can see here that only those parts of the signal that are above the threshold level are triggering the vocoder effect. Okay,
You're out.
so that's a very important setting.
Someone calls and you're out.
Okay, input on and off.
Out when someone calls.
So if you're playing with this and you're not getting any sound coming from the keyboard, this is probably where you want to go. Another place you can go is over here to this section, and you can load a file.
You're out when someone calls and you're out. When someone calls and you're out.
You can hear that now, because I didn't turn input off, we had both inputs, the file input and my microphone, so not microphone, the external app input.
And you're out when someone calls and you're out.
Okay, by pressing that trash can, I delete the file. Okay, so that's about input. Over here, dry and
You're
wet.
out when someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls.
So you can see when it's fully wet, we won't hear any of the original signal unless we start pressing the keys, and then it's going to be processed to greater or lesser degrees depending
You are
on
out when someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out.
Okay. Here is where we can save presets. We already talked about this preset loading menu. So here, we have the carrier oscillators. In a vocoder, we have a modulating signal, which in this case is being provided by the sample here. And then we have the carrier.
When calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls
So
and
with
you
the
are
dry and
out.
wet
When
knob, we
someone
can hear
calls and you are out. When someone
how
calls
the carrier
and
is
you are out.
modulating.
When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out. When some.
So the carrier is basically what gives it the musical aspect here. Now, here in the carrier section, we have these buttons where we can select which oscillator we are adjusting the settings for. So here we've got oscillator 1, and by swiping from left to right, we are controlling the duty cycle. This is the ratio of the positive and negative signal. If we look at a typical square wave, for example, this has a duty cycle of 50-50 because it spends half its time up here and half its time down here. So if we have this right at 50, then it is a square, but here it's going to be various variations on different rectangular ratios. The red line we can change by moving up and down on the y-axis, right? So x-axis controls the duty cycle. And with a small duty cycle, we'll end up with thinner sounds.
When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out.
And you might not notice it that much depending on what is set up in the other oscillators. But if you go in and you change the duty cycle of every oscillator fully down or fully up or whatever, then you'll get more idea of what these are doing. So the red is the weight, which is basically something like the gain for each oscillator. So let's put them all up.
You are out. When someone calls and you are out. Someone calls and you are out. You are out. When someone calls.
So we start getting variations on the sound there.
When someone calls and you are.
Let's take a look at another.
When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out.
Okay, so what's happened here,
you are out. When
you can
someone
see
calls and you are out. When
that
someone
in this
calls
preset the
and you
notes are
out.
being
When
held.
someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls.
So this we can adjust by pressing here. This is our hold on and off. Here we control whether it is monophonic or polyphonic.
When someone calls and you are out.
This is monophonic.
And you are out. When someone calls and you are out. When someone.
Polyphonic.
When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are.
Not that noticeable with that preset. Let's try another one.
And you are out. When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out. When someone.
Right, we're getting chords there. Here we control
And
the
you are out. When someone calls. You are out. When someone calls and you are out. When
octave range that the keyboard is at. And here we control the glide. Change this to monophonic again.
When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out.
So we're changing the glide amount here. Okay.
You are out. When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls.
Okay. So what else do we have in the carrier section? We have here the octaves for the oscillators. So we can adjust that. And we can also
When someone calls
adjust
and you are out.
detune.
And you are out. When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls.
Here we have the number of bands. With a higher number of bands, the modulating signal will be clearer.
Calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out. When someone. You are out. When someone calls. You are out. When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls. When someone calls and you are out.
Oh yeah.
When someone calls and you are out.
So here, right, let's turn bands off because that was being modulated just now.
Someone calls and you are out. When someone calls, you are out. When someone calls. When someone calls and you are out.
So this is pretty fun to play with.
And you are out.
And definitely fun to modulate.
When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls.
Okay. What else have we got here? Okay, here we can adjust the attack and release.
When someone calls and you are out.
See, that's taken some time to come in.
When someone calls and you are
Got a nice fast attack there.
and you are out. When
Slower
someone
attack. Here we have the release.
calls and you are out. When someone
So here,
when someone
as soon as I take my finger off,
someone
the sound shuts off.
and you are out. When someone
Here it lingers for a while. Okay. Here, frequency.
you are out. When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and
This
you
is
are out. When someone calls
also set
and
up
you are
in the
out.
modulation
When
at the
someone
moment.
calls and you are out. When someone
Okay. Here, the number of bits.
when someone calls when someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out.
We're getting
When
really
someone calls
lo-fi here.
when someone calls and you are out. 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 When someone
Okay. Here we control the pitch tracking. Let me go back to...
Putting it on my voice. Maybe a little bit clearer. Okay, first of all, here we turn on the note quantization. So this will snap me to the nearest semitone, I guess. And here we have a choice between absolute and relative tracking. I am singing now. I am singing now. Okay, it's quite here to let me turn this off.
It's quite hard to hear the difference there, but basically the absolute setting will track more closely the actual pitch of each note that you sing, and the relative tracking is in some way related to the pitch of the note that came before. I'll have to admit that I don't really understand the relative tracking that well here. So maybe Erik could pop in the comments and clarify it a little bit, perhaps. And here we, if we increase the pitch tracking amount, then we get more pitch tracking. Okay. Here we set up the delays. So amount, that should be fairly clear. Divide is related to the delay time. We change that by going from left to right. So here we're getting shorter delay times, longer delay times. So no sound, probably input off. Let's see, let's try a different one.
calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out. When someone calls and you are out.
Not getting anything there, let's see. Oops. Oh, hang on. Silly me. Wrong instance.
Someone calls and you're out. When someone calls and you're out. When calls and you're out.
Okay, right. Sorry about that. Let's try this again.
When someone calls, when someone calls, when someone calls,
Right, got a lot of
when
delay
someone
going on
calls, when someone calls, and you're out. You're out when someone calls, when someone calls, when someone calls, when someone calls, when someone calls. You're out when you're out, and you're out, and you're out, and you're out. When someone calls, and you're out.
I think there's a lot of potential fun to be had there.
Calls and you're.
Okay, that's the delay section. Here we have the flanger. So here we control the speed.
Out when someone calls and you're out. 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 When someone calls.
And here we control the length.
When someone calls and you're out. 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 When someone calls.
Now here is where we can, again, we can load waveforms. We can edit the waveforms. We can divide them into sections. Let's get one where this has maybe been set up already. Okay, see, this one, vowels. You can see the way it's skipping about between these predefined sections. Here we can move from one section to another. For example, for editing purposes. You can go in and make them shorter and longer and so on. We can delete sections, we can add sections. This little lollipop thing, what have we got going on here? Right. So here, okay, you can see the ice cream. This is frozen, it says. And here we have different kind of amounts of frozenness. I'll explain in a second. And here the freeze is off. So let's listen to what happens when I turn the freeze on. It has frozen the modulator at the point in time that I changed it to frozen. So you see it's slightly different each time depending on exactly what point I froze it at. Now here it freezes, but it resets every bar. Here it resets every half bar. And so on, right? The trash can is where we can delete the waveforms. This is an important control. So here we change the keyboard behavior. So see what this says, play on new chord. Okay, check this out. Oh, nothing happening, why is that? Okay, so this one is doing continuous loop. Here it's being re-triggered every time I press a new note. Can't figure out why this one is not doing anything. So here it's playing when there's a new chord, and if I press a note while a chord is playing, we also get a re-trigger. So, I think we've covered pretty much everything there. Let's see. Okay, we have a quantize here to various divisions of the tempo. All right, so there we go.
When someone calls, then you are out. 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 When someone calls. Here come the clouds. Here come the clouds. Here come the clouds. Here come the clouds. I am a robot.
You see, this is pretty cool, right?
I am a robot.
This one is not looping.
I am a robot.
And each note will move it forward to the next section. So this is the kind of cool thing that you can do by going in and messing with the edit section here, playing around with the division points in these loops.
I am a robot. I am a robot. I am a robot. I am a robot. I am a robot.
All right. Oh, one more thing I forgot, I think, to mention. In the carrier section, when you tap on the oscillators, you can change the type. So saw, square, although it's only going to be an actual square if the duty cycle is 50-50. And here, noise.
I am a...
Let's just have a little listen to how those can change things. Again, remember that if you only change it in one oscillator, the change will not be that noticeable. So let's just change all of these to noise.
Robot, robot, robot. I am a robot. I am a robot. I am a robot. I am a robot.
So you see there's not much harmonically going on there. Let's try all saw.
A robot. I am a robot.
Now let's try all square.
I am a robot. I am a robot. I am a robot.
All right, pretty cool. Well worth checking out. And by the way, everybody, Erik has very kindly offered a free code to the lucky winner. So if you want a chance to win a free copy of this, I will declare the winners probably 2 days from now, which is not too long to wait, I think. And all you have to do is subscribe to the channel if you haven't before, give this video a like, and write a comment. And in the comment, when you write a comment, please do not write, I want a free app or whatever. Just write any interesting comment. Anybody who writes any kind of comment will be eligible to win. Okay, thanks a lot, everyone. Happy playing.